You are listening to Fair Enough by ART COLOGNE and TEXTE ZUR KUNST. Your deep dive into the global art world. Thoughtful, intentional, and always ready to play.
Hello, and welcome to Fair Enough, a podcast series by ART COLOGNE in collaboration with TEXTE ZUR KUNST. Fair Enough brings together artists, curators, writers, and thinkers to reflect on how art and its institutions are responding to the urgencies of our present moment. This season, marking the 35th anniversary of TEXTE ZUR KUNST, we're taking up the journal's motto for the year, "There is no art without criticism." Each episode returns to a past issue of the journal to revisit the debates it sparked and to consider how those questions continue to shape the cultural and political landscape today. Today's conversation reflects back on TEXTE ZUR KUNST's issue on poetry, which was published in September 2016. My name is Micaela Dixon, and I am your host, and today we are joined by Alicja Melzacka. Alicja works as a curator and a writer. In 2023, she co-founded Cellador, a project space dedicated to doing things with words, run collectively by a reading group in Brussels. In the past years, Melzacka has collaborated with artists and institutions across Belgium, the Netherlands, and beyond. Recent curatorial projects include Eye Below Ear at the Kunsthalle in Mechelen, a group exhibition that was scored as a musical composition, and Hypertext Hotel at SB34 in Brussels, which approached the exhibition as a form of interactive fiction. Thank you for joining us today. I wanted to ask you a question about your recent exhibition that you curated at the Kunsthalle in Mechelen in Belgium. The exhibition was titled Eye Below Ear. And in the exhibition text, you open with a line about how the U-shaped galleries of the Kunsthalle host several audio and light installations, spatial installations, and a video. There are performances with and without performers, there are senders and receivers, and there is poetry. I wanted to start with that last part, there is poetry. How do you see poetry or the poetic functioning as a device in exhibition making?
So in that particular exhibition, we were working around the notion of voice, and in particular a voice that's non-normative. So we are looking at types of speech and communication that are perhaps not performing to their fullest capacity in like the kind of, sense that they would be expected to do in terms of economic efficiency, clear communication, stuff like that. So we were looking at specific types of accents. We were looking at speech impediments, stuttering, and so forth. And some artists also worked with what I would call like peripheral matter of language, so things that are part of our everyday communication, but they are not like semantic components themselves, and they're not words. So all of the hesitation markers, which I'm profusely using also right now, and these kinds of things. So and I realized, because the concept of the show evolved in dialogue with the artist, it started from like quite an open premise and a certain interest of mine. It more and more kind of drifted in this direction of speaking about language without using text in the exhibition space. So when I say that there is poetry, I mean that there are works that focus on the kind of extra semantic qualities of language. There are works that focus on qualities of rhythm and melody, prosody, things like that. And then they also manifested themselves through different media, like sound, video, and so forth.
Can you give us an example of one of the artworks in that exhibition that you think like lends itself in a way to this notion of the poetic?
I think one good example is the work of Jerome Ellis, and they are a musician and performer based in Virginia. And I was very touched and attracted by the album called Clearing, which is not Jerome's newest work, but it was one of the two works in the show that were existing pieces, but I felt like they, in a very particular way, very also personal way, approached or opened up the topic, which otherwise might sound a little bit abstract, you know, talking about non-semantic qualities of language, you know, talking about rhythm, talking about composition. So I felt that this was a beautiful example because it worked on so many levels. So there is the record that contains spoken word and music. And Jerome is multi-instrumentalist, like working frequently also with sax, but also electronics. And then it's accompanied by a book. It's one work basically. And the book, you can see it kind of as a reader for the record or a lyrics book, because it's like each chapter corresponds to one piece of music from the record. And in their music, Jerome frequently works with pauses and silences as a sort of compositional device. And that's also very strong to me because it's working simultaneously on the level of form and content, because in the music, what's being spoken about is also, for instance, voice as a tool of resistance. For instance, use of silence as a tool of resistance. History of singing and slavery. So let's say thematically or content-wise, there are many links made between voice and politics. And then on the level of form, you also have this interrogation of gaps and pauses. Then in the book, it's kind of, the lyrics also gradually become more and more deformed and start taking more concrete shapes. So it comes very close to concrete poetry.
One of my kind of questions, I suppose, when I was thinking about like poetry and the way that poetry would take shape in an exhibition, was whether it's a bit of like an abstract question, whether you think on some level that an aspect of like poetry or the poetic is situated in opposition to like literalness. So maybe an example, Jerome's work is kind of interesting in particular because there's also a way of using specific letters or devices of clearing of gaps as a way to open up a space in particular, which maybe doesn't have a relationship between like literalness or not. But I wonder where that situates for you, or where that idea lands for you in general.
Yeah, I think in a way you touched upon something here that's definitely interesting. I have had to think when you were speaking of this quote from Melissa Gordon's book Vital Signs, where she kind of poses similar question, but she asks, is the inverse of abstraction literalness or making sense? So there is some form of parallel that forms itself between like poetry as abstraction and prose as figuration. However, I don't know. It's also I also don't want to be like a relativist and you know, open up the Pandora box and talk about what poetry.
Yeah,
because you have so many types of poetry. Like, to me, let's talk about the poetry that I find interesting, and also I think it kind of illustrates how it may function in the exhibition context. It's when the significance that's produced on different levels, you know, on the level of form, structure, and then content, maybe even context, maybe visual level. When those different levels do something, activate one another in a way, or make the reader, sorry. So when these levels activate one another, sometimes can function also in their opposition to one another, which I find very stimulating. You know, sometimes you can have a poem which is syntactically sound, the structure of the sentence makes sense, so to say, grammatically, but then semantically it's very confusing. So then the kind of structures of language hold it together. You could say that it's correct or it's literal, as in you read the sentence, but semantically there's something off. Or the opposite, you have lots of poems that, especially the kind of poetry I guess I'm more interested is this poetry that's really on the verge, of visual art, concrete poetry, but also language poets. Of course, this link between language poetry and conceptualism and scoring. Maybe we're gonna end up there.
Yeah.
But so in this kind of poetry, you also have like frequently different strategies, like be it formal or processual in terms of constraints, that generate some degree of like fragmentation, incompleteness. And I think that's the poetic in it, the kind of tension between very productive tension. One of the things if we speak about like metaphors, of poetry, between poetry and art, I had to also think immediately of like poetry as ready-made, maybe even more than abstraction, like and of course it's just not all poetry, but I think the type of poetry that I'm interested in also frequently does that. It's like language already exists and it's kind of drawing on this repertoire, sometimes like literally picking up bits and pieces from overheard conversations, other times just kind of addressing language that's not necessarily like literary discourse, but like a daily language. So I think this idea of ready-made and poetry, there is something there in those different levels of signification.
I mean, I think fragmentation, there's a really interesting word to bring up, because on some level, you can think of like postmodernism in particular as being really associated with this idea of fragmentation, that our lives in the 21st century are like, we live very fragmented in quote existences, etc. And then maybe this is an interesting way to think back about poetry and exhibition making too, that there's a bit of a way to incorporate poetry which is in form fragmented or can lend itself to a fragmented form. Or even I'm thinking about the piece in the TEXTE ZUR KUNST issue on poetry by Tim Griffin, where he speaks about being in the grocery store and texting his partner about something that like they might pick up for dinner, and then the way that autocorrect works on his phone transforms the sentence of his into a kind of fragmented poem, but he sends it anyway. And he also speaks to this like idea in a sense of immediacy. But what's so interesting for me, I think, about this idea of like fragmentation, poetry, etc. I mean, poetry is a form in general that I have been, especially in the last 5 years, maybe more, really, especially drawn to, maybe also because of my background, etc. But because I think the forms of possibility or interpretive possibilities in poetry are so much more open than they are in different, let's say in particular, in different written forms like prose, etc. So it's kind of, it almost offers this opportunity to think a bit beyond, like, as you said, like it's a bit beyond, it's more than, what is it? It's when someone says something in particular, it's, it's, oh my gosh, I will get there. It's
like sort of,
or it's like, it's more than just the sum of its parts, basically, somehow, I think, like from an interpretive perspective. And so that's also part of my sort of like curiosity and my, I think, attraction to an aspect of the form. When I was rereading the preface for the TEXTE ZUR KUNST piece for the issue, it was talking also about how, it kept referring to this idea of like the artist poet in particular. So this sort of figure who's also somehow like approaching poetry in a somehow it feels like quite an open register. We've even spoken about it before, like not necessarily like as a poet in particular, but as a kind of person that's using poetry to a particular end, and also asking this question of like how it can be used in general, which would be a kind of a subjective question. It's a long-winded way of asking you. What do you think? What's your sense of where poetry sits in contemporary art right now?
Wow, yeah, indeed. That's a handful of strings to pull. Let me think. I maybe will start by also referring to that same issue, which I'm grateful you shared with me, and I read parts of it and also the introduction, which I thought framed like an interesting question. I perhaps felt that at times it conflated the poetic quality with sort of semi-autobiographical / personal / confessional quality in writing at large. Because here we can also, it's a bit of like, I guess maybe it's just this discussion on terminology. But I guess in common understanding, when we talk about poetic quality or poetic language, it means in some sense, figurative or emotive, or having an affective quality rather than just like purely, I don't know, asking for sort of hermeneutic mode of interpreting the text.
Yeah.
That you can enjoy it on different levels. Which again, I think it's like a traditional notion of it, of how poetry uses these literary devices to, through form, also convey the emotive content of it. And then of course you have like lots of poetry that kind of reclaimed everyday language, that reclaimed prose, prose poetry, poetry lectures, like David Anton doing like, kind of spoken essay form as poetry.
But I agree with what you're saying, that I think it's true that, when we think about the poetic or poetry in general, we do often think maybe have a more classical understanding of what that is, like what we're thinking of, rather than these more diverse forms that it does take up, like poetry as anything, you know what I mean? These things that come afterwards, like lectures as poetry, or these not just like things like spoken word, but that there is the definition of this thing in particular ends up being a lot more diffuse than its original kind of signification, or etc.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, you also had Flarf, this movement with like early electronic poetry, when we also were gathering, it's like Twitter poetry basically, gathering language or finding language online and just using it as a ready-made, and a lot of conceptual poetry, things like that. But there are two things I wanted to still say to that exhibition as a poetic form today. Like one thing is that one of the kind of defining aspects of poetry I like to think of is this openness, which you also mentioned. There is this text from Hejinyan. She wrote about the rejection of closure in the open form, and that the kinds of language that are open and kinds of language that are closed. She also claims certain types of poetry could be closed, certain forms of like lyrical poetry or poetry that really drives a specific like vision or epiphany, as she calls it. But to me, that's the potential it has to keep that openness. And another aspect I like about it is that to me it's kind of almost always performative in how it uses language. And I really mean performative in the sense of like, linguistic performative speech act, when like an utterance enacts a change in reality. Here it's almost like the way the words come together or letters come together, it can be quite can happen on different levels, or the way that paragraphs come together, gaps. It kind of produces something each time you read it. So it's really like performing language as you read it, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And that's also something I found this quote, which puts it much simpler and better than I'm trying to describe it, which is that language, it's from Monica Rink, and she says language is taking place within the text. And I love this notion of like language taking place, this temporality, because that also emphasizes this more active role of the reader. the kind of the work of maybe putting it together, but also the enjoyment of maybe not being able to fix it once and for all, if it's a good poem. That's what I kind of feel, you can rediscover it several times and always focus on another level on which it operates.
Yeah.
And in my, let's say, curatorial or work as an art writer, I'm kind of intensely focused on the relationship between text and image, let's call it, or visual arts and writing at large. So not specifically poetry, really. But I think it also comes from this awareness of like the power of language and what it does. I know it's like a massive, massive open-ended statement, but I really like thinking about the status a text has in an exhibition, like how language enters an exhibition through the curatorial, through the educational, mediation from the artists, and like what are those different, the different ways in which these texts behave, but also different positions or kind of hierarchy of meanings they produce. The part of the text you quoted is very descriptive and very like super literal.
Yes, yeah.
Because the entire text is a transcript of an audio description. So that was also the idea, since in the exhibition there was a lot of like, there were many shifts between like literacy and orality. And this field of tension was really kept within the works. I wanted to also somehow make it visible through the form of the text or the genre of the text. And it produced this weird kind of double voice in a way, because you are reading it and it sounds very, very oral. Like you can read it and feel like it's been written to be read out loud. And you can ask yourself also, why do you describe these specific things? I was really interested in how audio description functions. And how the choices are made in that process, and what's the difference between writing for the ear and writing for the eye. And I think also that's where, again, like poetry for me resides. It's like in between orality and literacy, and it's writing for both.
One of the things that always really strikes me, I think, about the form of poetry in general is that, as you say, orality is such a fundamental feature of it, also because of how it begins, like how storytelling around poetry begins in like classical, like in the Iliad, etc. But the other thing that I often think about when it comes to poetry and how you remember it is the question of like, is rhythm in particular. That when certain poems adopt a very particular rhythm and as a kind of, let's say, gesture, there's a way that this sticks in your brain for actually quite a long time, and it's an interesting approach to language in particular, because it's, regardless, I think, of the meaning at the center of each sentence or each line, there's a relationship to language that sometimes I see as being fundamentally expensive, and I don't mean and I'll explain what I mean. The obvious thing would be to say, like, in prose, language is cheap, and in poetry, language is expensive. But I don't mean it so much like black and white. But I have always been thinking about how, in general, in the act of writing a poem or of reading a poem, depending on, how you situate yourself towards it, there's a specific level of care, I think, going on at the level of the sentence, because you have to really think about how you say certain things, how you ascribe certain things. So there is a preciousness. Maybe that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. And as you mentioned, like the press text for exhibitions, etc., it's an interesting kind of midway point, because the exhibition text is always trying to explain or sort of demonstrate something that's going on to a viewer who comes into a space that often is more visual than, language based. But what's interesting in contemporary art, I think, nowadays too, is how certain artists wrestle with this contradiction. And so using poetry, using some aspect of like the poetic as a way to kind of like break free of this sense of convention, which is also why I kind of liked in Texte Zur Kunst this thinking back of like the artist poet or bringing these kind of these yeah, like these figures together, so not seeing them as such distinguished figures.
Yeah, I think how I also wanted to maybe approach the notion of poetic in exhibition making was not only through the presence of text necessarily, but more these dynamics between form, content, context, you know, kind of syntactical, semantical relationships that you can produce between the works, you know, within the works. And yeah, so it's not necessarily, I mean, I also don't mean to use language as metaphor for everything.
No, of
but
course.
To be honest, in my practice, I do think through language a lot when I work on shows. It always comes from an interest in a text or a specific kind of literary or linguistic phenomenon. It's shared with the artist. We talk about it. Usually all artists are also writers. I have this kind of weak spot for it. So artist writer or artist poet. I mean, I was also quite intrigued by this diagnosis or sort of observation on the emergence of the artist poet. It's also from a few years ago, right? It's
2016.
16, right?
Yeah.
And
but it feels somehow like it's coming back. Does that make sense? Or it's back somehow to me.
It is. I think many things, I mean, there were many things that I felt like, oh, it really rings a bell. Like this notion of immediacy, which then, you know, recently has been so interestingly fleshed out by Anna Kornblumen's book on immediacy. So I was like, oh, did they like refer to Kornblum? And I was like, oh no, they couldn't
before.
have.
I know.
It's before.
I had the same thought.
Right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
You know, the return of auto theory and auto fiction as a genre in art writing. But where is poetry, really? I mean, you know, maybe I'm not in the right circles, but I feel like poetry, in the sense of like genre of poetry, is perhaps a bit less present. I think artists are still, you know, there is this feud between like painting and poetry historically, and like this notion of them being like sister arts. I mean, I guess that also can make it more difficult to sort of combine it within the exhibition with the works of visual art, because it's not like an auxiliary relationship. Then it feels like two different media, like speaking to one another, which I find very interesting. Like it basically comes back to this notion of ekphrastic writing, which is this, which comes back also to the ancient Greek ideas about aesthetics and sort of mimetic purpose of arts, and this discussion on, okay, how does painting relate to that, and how does poetry relate to that? So they kind of this entire paradigm of comparing the two arts started back then. So this early, the earliest known instance of ekphrasis is considered to come from Iliad, and specifically this description of the shield of Achilles, and sort of, you know, the visual qualities of it. And yeah, I also found this entire, I feel like this entire discussion on the relationship between the two, you know, throughout the art history, which varied from like seeing them as competing forces, you know, there was this notion of paragone, competition of different arts, to like seeing them as complementary, as equals, you know, one subjugated to another. So it's like, you know, basically like sisterhood. You sometimes fight, you sometimes but it's constantly coming back, you know. There is also there are so many links between like formalism and medium thinking of medium specificity during like neoclassicism. This idea of the new Laocoon, you know, the book that was written by Lessing, in which she criticized sort of approaches to sculpture specifically, but also painting that focus on the narrative or on temporal aspects. He says like, no, these are spatial media, and we should focus on they are, you know, limited in time. and they evolve in space, versus literature evolves in time and its narrative and so on. So like, you know, this kind of, it rings a bell, right? It's like kind of immediately recognizable in like later discourses. And for instance, Greenberg also called his essay towards a newer Laocoon. So I feel like these discourses, they keep coming back, and then perhaps in, I don't know, maybe it's a stretch, but you know, I kind of see the resurfacing of that sisterhood or sistership in maybe auto-theoretical writing, or these forms of writing that engage with art, but then also are to some extent a work on their
working of themselves.
For
sure.
Themselves.
Yeah.
So you know, like this kind of it's a sort of oscillation between separation and togetherness, and drawing from one another, you know, like drawing qualities from other media, this intermediality of in postmodernism especially, this kind of exploded again. So I feel like this sister arts debate was again reignited, even though no one called it like that, but you know, everyone talked about transmediality, image, text, early computing, you know, like, so
it feels like something somehow is fundamentally still not resolved, maybe like in this question, and maybe like will never be resolved because of how both, as you say, like one deals really in a spatial register, one deals kind of across time. So there's fundamental differences, but it's interesting how they also come close to one another. Sometimes they try to represent in their own languages, in their own ways, the same things, like allegories, like Achilles' shield, like etc. Which is always, I also think, an interesting thing as somebody who's paying attention. If you pay attention to both in ways, you also see different like forms of thought, right, that are emerging, that are really fundamentally different languages. Actually, like you can still call, if you call painting a kind of like visual language in its own right, and like the poetic like that too.
Yeah, but I also feel like that this unbridgeable gap or the conflict actually is what drives development in both. That's what brought out like lots of sort of, I don't like the word, but like innovation or, you know, experimental formats. So there's a ton of poetry that's, I don't know, spatialized, you know, visual, concrete poetry, like, you know, and the other way around. So like these categories, I mean, I'm not sort of advocating for medium specificity as a sort of the right way to think about it, but I think historically it just points to how the two kind of maybe accelerated one another.
It's interesting what you say. It's something that it's been on my mind actually for a long time, has been this question of like, if this is really like a bit of an experimental question, but whether in a form like poetry, it's possible to make a poem about itself. So at one point, this kind of question came up for me, whether language could fundamentally only be about itself, or whether that wasn't really possible in a form. My personal kind of thought process afterwards, after thinking about it for some time, also thinking through like some like deconstructionist thinkers, for example, in particular, who are always playing with like languages being somewhat absurd. Where I landed on this was, I actually think that a poem can't be about itself. It has to be about something. Somehow. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it, but I felt like on some level, the something in question doesn't have to be evident. It doesn't have to be a question of like literalness. It can be vague. It can be completely suspended. It's also not about necessarily having a meaning always be conveyed, but at the heart of this form, at the heart of like this content, there has to be something. And that, let's say the shell can't just be about itself. Does that make sense? It can't just be self-referential.
I mean, that's very interesting. I think it can. The question is it interesting? Or is it, you know, does it produce, because it's an experimental question and it's an experimental answer. I guess I'm going to try to think out loud. Yeah.
I mean,
actually, wait, sorry. May I say something?
Yeah, please.
now that I'm thinking out loud, so there are two things I want to say. One is Jakobson, the other is Ulysses Carrion. Let's start with Jakobson. I think the distinction that we're making here, which I also was trying to make in the previous comment, he also mentions like different functions of language. And one he calls a poetic function. There are 6 of them. One of them is poetic, one of them is metalingual or metalinguistic. I don't remember right now, but it's clear. It's a meta function, and I think how the distinction that he makes is a bit how I also understand poetry, and it also touches upon this idea of a work talking about itself. So a poetic function of language is language that has heightened self-focus, self-reflexivity, or it's maybe recursive. So it's also foregrounds more this language as material and poetic language usage, but its topic need not be language itself, right? So for instance, and it can also happen in like other hybrid genres. Like one example I really like, and I often give it as an example, is like a work by Maria Fusco called Eczema! And it's an audio play as far as I know, or it's like also recorded, exists as a sound work, but it's also written, and I wouldn't necessarily call it poetry. It's like this poetry prose, and for most part it's really prose. It's kind of almost diaristic, but there are bits that really like lean heavily into poetry, like language becomes completely restructured, fragmented, and it reflects very well the itchiness of eczema, the kind of obsessive repetition of scratching, the discomfort of it, the pace, the heat. And I feel like that's what this poetic quality is, when you have this, formal, I don't know, aspects of language also enhance the content. And then Jakobson talks about this meta-linguistic function, which is then language that's recursive, but also talks about itself. So it's the code about the code. And I think this also exists. And at first I told you that I thought it was not interesting, but actually now I have an example of it being interesting. Because I was thinking about some books of kind of artists, poets I liked, and what I have in my library. And I have this book by Ulysses Carrion called Sonnets. And, well, firstly, I think that's also a good example of the nexus, between poets and visual artists, or conceptual artists particularly. And it's a great example of like an artist book that uses poetry as its material, basically. But what he does in this book, he took a poem, a sonnet by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and he republishes it 44 times. And each time he applies a different typographic procedure, constraint, and he gives it a title. So in a way you could say, okay, it's kind of called computational, almost, formal game of changing parts. But then something really interesting happens between those poems, between the iterations, and also between the body of the sonnet and the title, because they kind of point to, I will just give you an example. It's fantastic. Like the first one is also great. It's called Borrowed Sonnet, and it's just a sonnet, as it is. And then it goes through different motions of like, some are purely typographic, of like capital sonnets.
And the text itself.
It's the same text, capitalized and underlined. But then it becomes more and more, that's also what I like. It slides from like one level on which language operates, like, okay, visual, typographic, to another level, because later, for instance, one of my favorite ones is cautious sonnet. And at first I was like, why is this a cautious sonnet? And I kept like, coming back to the original and comparing it. And the only thing he did is that in the second verse, there is a word meaning that's used, but as the meaning of all things that are. That's the line. And in the original, I mean, in the adapted version, he puts meaning in quotation marks. And that's everything he does. And I thought that's really fantastic, you know, like
it's really a question of like playing with the form, as you say, of like the written word, but not so much with like the content of it, or very little
with the form, but also like then immediately it opens this, you start talking about maybe instability of meaning, and then he kind of pulls it, he continues that thread in another poem, another sonnet, where he kind of gives different definition of meaning, or the synonyms, to the word meaning in the brackets following that word. Exhaustive sonnet, it's called. And then he has like, he mentions like meaning, sense, significance, signification, import, point, thrift, and he continues and continues. So, you know, on the one hand, yeah, it's formal, but it is also, the content of the poem is meaning making through poetry. So you could say it's totally self-referential. It's not about, I don't know, the love of God or nature or whatever, however you'd like to interpret this Rossetti's sonnet. Yeah, but it's still, to me, it is very interesting.
Yeah.
It is producing some...
It's producing an interesting affect when it comes on the level of language. It reminds me also of this quote in the poetry issue, which I'll read because I thought I would bring it up because it also speaks to what you were talking about, this this poetry, this like that was like almost convulsing or a bit almost compulsive.
Right.
It's this line that says, "Poems validate the experience of convulsion by showing that incorporation into the stabilizing model of language and the world can only ever be provisional, that instability and change are inherent to consciousness." It's a quote by Anya Utler from her new book. But I thought that you were speaking about like convulsion, and then I thought I was really interested by this way of thinking about, on some level, that, you know, the way we speak, it, of course, is a model of language. It's also a pattern of language that we repeat, and that poetry enters in a way that is, of course, provisional, brief somehow too, and it's unstable. And then the shaky foundations of meaning kind of become clearer to us in general. And that's also one of its functions that can be quite interesting when it's also adopted by, let's say, like artists, poets, or poets in general.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you really phrased it well. Making already inherent or already existing instability of all language or text. I mean, I was also thinking about that question of the return or more visibility that now is granted to, like, let's say, artists writing or artists working with poetic strategies in particular. And I think that's one thing, but another thing is also the entry of poetry and poets, let's call them, right, into the art world. Like, I've seen a couple of shows that incorporated works of poetry to different extents, and I think I also kind of jotted some down so I can refer to them more easily. Like, an interesting example was there was this show I saw last year at Trion L'Astéride in Marseille, and it was called Ode to Moray Eels. In translation, I'm not gonna attempt the French, title. And it was curated by Mathilde Balouali. And there was a work by Cécile Beaufort in collaboration with Aileen Miles. A few chains hanging from the ceiling with different objects attached to it. And amongst them, there were just strips of paper with kind of this characteristic handwriting and poems being scattered, which you can also then read in many different ways. So I thought this was interesting. And then I also saw that Eileen had an exhibition in 2018 at Bridget Donahue Gallery, and that was called, that's quite, I would say that's quite provocative.
As a solo show.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
wow.
it was called Poetry.
Oh, wow.
And what was exhibited are Instagram photos enlarged on the walls, like a selection of them.
Somehow very Richard print, but yes.
If we talk about artist poet or poet artist, and this component of like maybe your personality or your persona or your presence in the art world and in the social circles and kind of the relational aspects of that as part of the work, and as maybe as indispensable part of the work for the work to circulate.
Take on a meaning, etc. Yeah.
Or take on a meaning.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Then this is the example, right? Like the example. And then also on our kind of more local soil, so to say, there was a show last year in Leuven. And it was curated by Karen Verschoren and Zeynep Kubat. It was part of this festival, Artifact. I don't know if you've been. It's a very big kind of. There was lots of large-scale film installations, but also other media. So large-scale show on several locations. And then what I was very pleasantly kind of not surprised, but just kind of touched by, and I really remembered it for a long time after seeing the show, is the incorporation of some poetry. That was the first time I saw the work by Beatrice Gibson. I Hope I'm Loud When I'm Dead, which also borrows its title from Sease Conrad. Okay. And it features Sease Conrad, Eileen Myles, and other sort of poets, but also poets, activists, and this work just blew my mind. I thought it was so strong, and it's kind of work that I felt I needed because it really, it was very, it was critical, but it was also very uplifting in some ways. And I feel like if we talk about artist poets, then Beatrice Gibson is like a perfect example of filmmaker poet. I mean, she also does write. It's a film about film, but it's also a film about relations and people making work, making art, trying to survive. It was very strong, and this was a film that had a poetic quality, whatever we decide on
what that actually means.
What that actually means. All of it.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking actually is one that we should touch on was the question of like the personal voice in poetry in particular. But this Monica Rink quote stuck with me, and I will read it. She writes, "Poetic language is not about personality, not about direct access, not about confession qua confession, but about the interest in the poet as supplier with all the references and relationships to the process, to experience, to speech, to reality, to the systems of signs, where changes to the whole or to the parts reciprocally influence one another, to the world-creating power of language, to the beauty of language, its preeminence, its absurdity." What's interesting to me about this, which is maybe not so different from what we're saying in general, is that because she's understanding that I would almost say that some aspect of poetic language or poetic form like transcends subjectivity, probably. And that's why it's dealing always in like world creating power of language, the beauty of language, its preeminence, its absurdity, because that's the level at which it shines in a very particular register. So almost a simple way of putting it would be the end justifies the means. Does that make sense? That like the final product is it almost negates what like an example would be like, let's say you fall in love, you get your heart broken, totally, like stomped on, and then you create some like beautiful work about this process, but or about this experience, but the language then is somehow has a new
something.
it becomes something much beyond your own experience of having your heart broken, for example.
I mean, we don't control language. It's out there, and we let it travel. And from that moment onwards, it does things. I would say there is a sort of difference between, let's call it an author's voice. So my voice as I'm writing, what's in my head, and then the poetic voice, that's what happens when the poem is received. I feel like the poetic voice, it's basically what you also said, it transcends the body of the writer, the subjectivity of the writer. That's what gives birth to the voice. But the voice itself is something more than that, and less than that on that certain level. And this word creating power of language, that definitely resonates with also what I said about like language taking place and language acting, and also what you said about poetry being the kind of the type of language that makes different mechanics of how language functions in the world more evident. There were some other fragments in that quote that I found it was dense and a lot to unpack. She also talks about author as supplier before she moves on to talking about this transcendent kind of speculative, also political perhaps, quality of poetic language. So I was wondering also like what she meant by that, and how does this relate to this? I don't know, how do you understand that part?
I mean, I keep wrestling with it in my mind even now, because even just as I said, I think on some level the ends justify the means, then I also disagreed with it, maybe like a few seconds later, only to say that there is some like, and I don't want to conflate, subjective and personal experience, because I think those two can be similar, but also can be very different. I wonder whether maybe also one of the most enlightening, or one of the most kind of exciting things about poetic form too, is that it's also sort of a way of connecting an aspect of like of experience, but experience as almost like as having a particular meaning. Sometimes I find like what I like so much also about the form is that it seems to like, what I even mean when I say things like, oh, poetry to me can, or language can feel expensive, is that it makes an attempt to come or to approach kind of like a true meaning, or the real essence of something. And I think that like maybe when you think from a philosophical perspective, you would say that maybe the true essence of something can be only one thing. And maybe in poetry you have that a bit disrupted, but I'm still wrestling, I think, with this. I think I'm kind of, I'm wrestling with whether I agree or don't agree. I see like both sides of the coin, and I don't know where it lands somehow.
I think, I mean, I don't know if I share the same position on true truth and true meaning, or like ideals. So that might also affect my reading of it, because I feel like this contradiction is the future, right? It's a bit like the other contradictions we've been discussing today. So it sounds mutually exclusive, but also really, to me, is not. Like, it can be subjective,
It can be both.
and it doesn't need to be personal.
Yeah.
And there have been so many movements to try to like objectivize it, right? To, for instance, through like certain like also strategies in language poetry, but also, for instance, conceptual poetry, or I don't know, early computational work. Like if you look at Alison Knowles, for instance, and the House of Dust, where you have the computer generate like uncountable statements starting with the same, like always starting with the same few words about the house.
Also reminds me of this exhibition here in Brussels at the Jewish Museum with the John Giorno, like 1888 Dial a Poem, which is so it's really in the same vein that you talk about, this kind of like very generic, but also very, funny, absurd. Also, I mean, the phone is on a pedestal in the middle of the room, so you pick it up, you press any numbers on this like kind of old like wire telephone, so it's not that you can walk away with it. But it speaks to the same kind of sentiment that you mentioned too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also journal thing is also there are so many aspects to it. I mean, I love dial a poem. I think the actual line still works. You can call them. I once did.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, I don't
like
know how much it cost me because
oh my gosh.
But there are also like different editions of it in other countries. It's super nice. It's a great initiative. I think this also has a bit more to do with the social aspect of poetry, like, I mean, he was also extremely active in like social practice and activism and thinking about community of artists and writers and supporting each other also in times of like AIDS epidemic and so on. So I think, but then of course how it's also exhibited, it's then mediated through this very generic technology. I think I'm a sucker for these kinds of solutions.
Yes, also me.
So when I saw Alison Knowles, it was also presented like that. It was this fax machine that just was sputtering this paper forever. I mean, no, it already has done that. It was just displayed now. But And it was also part of the show. It was a show at Mudam, which was titled Radical Software. And I think Women, Art and Computing, something like that. And there were lots of that also showed this intersection of like, okay, now you have artists who work with early digital art, concrete poetry, typewriter art. There was like also textile, obviously, like textile computing, big connection. So like you had all of those links really fleshed out in that show.
We've sort of been talking a lot about, the personal, the affective, etc. I was thinking, like, given how much emotional, affective, and personal language shapes online and everyday discourses, do you think that this like affective voice or this poetic voice has changed how we experience art and curatorial writing? Or another question also would be, and whether how we also like how our writing has changed too.
Yeah. I see a lot of change for sure. To me, it was it felt like something. At first, it felt like something quite refreshing, also to write this way. I have to say, just from like a very, this is a personal perspective.
Totally
I've been trained in academic writing. I had a few, academic papers and dissertations behind my back, and it's a very different way. So to me, once I entered the cultural field and started working with artists and learning also from artists about different kinds of writing, reading more of, also auto fiction, auto theory, I got kind of at first like this gulp of fresh air, and it was like almost too much. And I guess it definitely changed how I started to write. It kind of liberated certain aspects of my writing practice. At the same time, now, having been doing this for a while, also having been very interested in more like the historical political context of auto theory as a genre, which is already something we can historicize and point to, its origins in a way. I feel like we should be critical of sort of to
adopt that like language a bit too much. You mean like to
to simulate too much of this immediacy or personality or personal sort of a connection between the writer and the audience, or the writer and the work. I also feel like sometimes it can be a way to I mean, it's very complex because it so depends on who writes it and how it's done. Like there are good examples of that,
Yeah.
and there are poor examples of that. Like, for instance, in general, I found Anna Kornbluh's criticism on point, as it has been already expressed also in this issue, and they were talking about immediacy and sort of neoliberal aesthetics,
Yeah.
let's say.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of like artists as their own, as marketers, as their own brand, and also same with the person. It's kind of a bit this cult of personality somehow is being like accelerated. You can see like the most extreme example of it would be like influencers somehow. You know what I mean? Like that on every level, you can kind of like economize some aspect of your personality into the post-Fordist machine of production, and then that will give you something back.
Yeah, this I guess, yeah, that's definitely another facet to that. Just to maybe say something to this critique, I think it's also worth considering how difficult materially the conditions of like art writers or artists are. So to me, the fact that people like combine different or like wear many hats, I have like total understanding for that. I think frequently it can even enrich their practice, because I'm generally interested in the practices on fringe or kind of margins of disciplines. I also don't mind those artists who are or practitioners who are very difficult to place. So you don't know anymore, okay, is he now an art critic or is he now an artist? If the work is good. I mean, it's as simple as that, I feel. And of course, there are ethical questions there too, like, okay, can you be at the same time producing discourse and kind of being the recipient of it, art criticism, for instance, which I think you can if you have your integrity and kind of choose the right jobs. And I don't know.
I like that you say too that at the beginning when you began writing too, that you also felt some aspect of this first sort of 2015, let's call it 2016 trend of like new journalism writing coming back under the name autofiction, etc. That it was a breath of fresh air, because I agree with you. I think for a lot of people who had been trained in like liberal arts universities at a certain moment in time, to read the writing of some of those writers. One person who we've mentioned before on the podcast is also Maggie Nelson, who comes really under attack in a way in Anna Kornbluh's book, but her argument is really interesting, and it was interesting to talk to her about it. But I think it was also interesting too to sort of also explain the perspective of, the person who comes up at a time where Maggie Nelson's writing for a moment in time is also really, as you mentioned, somehow it's refreshing to think about all the new ways you can consider and think about art and write about it without there being such a distinct form anymore. And then you have writers and thinkers who see that as a systematic breakdown, shall we say, and they see this example in particular, Maggie Nelson, other names we'll come to, as kind of using or systematically using that breakdown to their advantage. I don't know if it's so like negative. I don't think that there was it's that they meant, that they meant to cause some kind of like breakdown, but it's an interesting thing to have been wrestling with the last 10 years. Maybe in general, this conversation of poetry is also, we're wrestling with a lot of contradictions.
Yeah, and I think we're also, like I said, kind of sliding in and out into the conversation around auto theory and kind of personal voice, and which again I would rather distinguish from poetry or poetic voice. But maybe still to that, I feel like what you said about the timeliness of certain forms of writing and how they hit at that specific moment, how refreshing they can be, how they can open like sort of field of possibility. That's one thing, and the other thing is obviously like the political aspects of them too. I mean, certain like autofiction is kind of intimately connected with there are some auto-theoretical or auto-fictional books that I read, and I'm like, okay, I didn't need to read that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care what dinner parties you go to and which galleries you hang out with and who sleeps with whom. If it's ending at that. But maybe some people find it productive. Maybe that helps them navigate their dinner parties and their, romantic lives or whatever. But there are other books I read and I was like, wow, this is really eye-opening to me. For instance, also to experience that I don't share, but I know nothing about.
Yeah.
And here I'm also thinking of some books by Mackenzie Work, for instance, which I felt were very strong and very self-aware on what they're doing and what this means to
like certain communities in particular.
Yeah, and also what it means to theorize from your lived experience and the pitfalls of that. So there's also type of auto theory that addresses that already and incorporates it. But I think at large, if we talk about how this affected, because of course auto theory is also it's a genre of literature, and it can also be seen as a sort of tendency or approach that we can then apply to another genre, let's say exhibition text, or a catalog or whatnot, opinion piece in an art magazine. And I think in that sense, this has driven a rather positive change, I would say, towards more transparency, grounding your text in your specific situation, like more situated writing. I think like I love artists who write, and I don't mind that sometimes they're better writers than artists. You know, like it just happens over and over, and it can kind of the scale can also shift. You know, they can have periods of their work, and I mean there are writers who became artists. I don't know, like I think of Joseph Strauss. You know, and his like writing practice, which is great, and then the work, which basically is kind of everything that grew around it. You know, like reading lamps and posters, and so I think it's great that these things happen.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciated having you as a guest on the podcast and talking about this issue of poetry in contemporary art nowadays.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure. Let's talk more about poetry.
Yeah, please.
Thank you for listening to Fair Enough by Art Cologne and Texte zur Kunst, where ideas travel and perspectives expand. From the world's first art fair to 2 days conversations on modern and contemporary art. The dialogue continues, every fall live in Cologne. For more information, visit artcologne.com.